On the night of June 11, 1962, in Alcatraz prison, also known as the Rock, a prison the entire world considered inescapable, 3 inmates decided to challenge the impossible. Using primitive tools, they managed to plan and execute a daring escape that left the whole world in a state of bewilderment. How did they widen those narrow ventilation shafts? How did they build a raft from simple materials? And what happened to them after they escaped from the prison? These questions made people wonder. Did they truly achieve the impossible and reach their goal? Or was their fate to die in the cold waters of San Francisco Bay? Welcome, and today I'm going to tell you the story of the impossible escape from Alcatraz. But before we begin, don't forget to subscribe and activate the bell to be notified of our new story every week. In 1934, Alcatraz Island was transformed from a military base into a maximum security federal prison. The prison that became known as the Rock due to its location on an island in the middle of San Francisco Bay. The prison was designed to make escape impossible, a fact underscored by the history of failed escape attempts by inmates over the years. The prison itself was intended to house America's most dangerous criminals, those that no other prison could handle. That's why security was extremely tight. Guard towers and searchlights monitored the place day and night, with highly trained guards. The corridors were filled with alarm systems, and any unusual movement would trigger an immediate response from the guards, who would swarm the area. Even the water surrounding the island was part of the security. The water temperature was cold year-round, not to mention the powerful currents that would pull away anyone who tried to swim in it. On top of all that, it was also said to be infested with sharks. Alcatraz wasn't just an ordinary prison. It was a symbol of fear and dread. The inmates incarcerated there told tragic stories of the despair and terror they lived through every day. The thick concrete walls, the narrow cells, the long nights, and the sound of waves crashing against the island's rocky shore. It was a place straight out of a nightmare. That's why any attempt to escape from it was considered madness. From its opening in 1934, many inmates tried to escape, but most of them ended up either dead or recaptured. Every failed escape attempt reinforced the prison's reputation as inescapable and deepened the despair and frustration of any inmate who even thought about escaping. Let me tell you about some of the most famous failed attempts to show you how difficult it was. The first escape attempt from Alcatraz was in 1936. An inmate, Joseph Bowers, was assigned to burn trash in the prison's incinerator. On April 27th, while working as usual, he suddenly decided to make a run for it and began climbing the chain-link fence at the edge of the island. It was clear he was trying to escape. When the tower guards noticed what was happening, they started shouting at him, ordering him to come down immediately. But Joseph didn't respond and kept climbing. At that point, the guards opened fire and wounded him. The injury caused Bowers to fall from a very high altitude. The fall, of course, was violent and resulted in serious injuries from which he died. Bowers' story later became known as the desperate escape, showing how far inmates were willing to go for a chance at freedom. A year later, on December 16, 1937, 2 inmates, Theodore Cole and Ralph Rowe, who worked in the prison workshop, managed over a long period to saw through the iron bars covering the workshop window. One day, the weather was extremely foggy. The fog literally blanketed the entire island. They decided to make their escape on that day. They took advantage of the fog and began to sneak out of the prison through the workshop window. As soon as they reached the island's edge, they jumped into the water. From that moment on, no one saw them again. The thing is, that day wasn't just foggy. The weather conditions were extremely harsh, the water currents were incredibly violent, and the bitter cold was unbearable. Because of this, the authorities assumed they had drowned. But when their bodies never appeared, they thought the currents might have swept them far away. As a precaution, the FBI placed them on its most wanted list. Almost another year passed. On the night of Friday, January 13, 1939, another escape attempt would end tragically. 5 inmates, Arthur Doc Barker, William Martin, Rufus McCain, Henry Young, and Dale Stamphill were known as some of the most dangerous inmates in Alcatraz and were held in the most secure section of the entire prison. Despite this, they managed one day to escape their cells using tools they had crafted themselves. After successfully getting out, they moved quickly and quietly toward the island's shore. Their plan was to build a raft using materials they had collected. When they reached the shore, they began building it and preparing to escape. But as they were working, a guard in the watchtower noticed strange movement on the beach. As soon as he realized what was happening, gunfire rained down on the inmates from every direction. Arthur Barker was fatally wounded and died instantly. Dale Stamphill was seriously injured but survived. The other 3 inmates were captured and placed in complete isolation afterward, with security on them becoming even tighter than before. Several years passed with a few minor attempts, all of which also failed until we reach April 14th, 1943. On this day, a daring escape attempt was made by 4 inmates who also worked in the prison workshop: James Borman, Harold Brest, Floyd Hamilton, and Fred Hunter. The 4, while working in the workshop, did the same thing. They cut the iron bars on the workshop window one by one. They had also stolen 4 bags used for guards' uniforms to use as flotation devices. On the night of the escape, the inmates overpowered 2 guards, tied their hands and gagged them, and then escaped through the window. But during the escape, one of the guards managed to reach his whistle, and the other guard began blowing it. As soon as the tower guards heard the whistle, they started firing at the inmates. James Borman was hit by a bullet and fell into the water, losing consciousness. Harold Brest caught him and held on to him as he floated on his bag. But when a prison boat approached, Brest was forced to let him go in the hope that he himself could escape. James drowned in the water, and his body was never found. At the same time, Fred Hunter was shot in the back and hands and lost hope of being able to swim. He decided to hide in a cave on the island. But after 2 hours of searching, the guards were able to find him due to the blood trail at the cave's entrance. As soon as they cornered him, he surrendered immediately and was captured. The only one left after this whole ordeal was Floyd Hamilton. At first, the guards thought he had drowned like Borman, but in reality, Hamilton was hiding in the same cave as Hunter. After waiting for 2 days in the cave, despair took over, and he decided to return to the same window he escaped from and hid in a storage room. He was caught the very next day. In the end, James Borman paid with his life, while Brest, Hunter, and Hamilton were captured and returned to prison with even harsher sentences. 2 years passed with more than one attempt, all of which also failed early on, until we reached 1946, when one of the most violent escape attempts in the history of Alcatraz took place, which later became known as the Battle of Alcatraz. Between May 2 and May 4th, a group of inmates attempted to escape. Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, Sam Shockley, Clarence Carnes, Marvin Hubbard, and Moran Thompson. The 6 inmates began their plan by taking control of the cell block. After overpowering the guards, they reached the armory and seized everything inside. Their plan was to escape using the prison's own boat, but when they couldn't open the prison's outer door, they decided on a confrontation. A battle ensued in which they managed to take 2 prison guards as hostages. After 2 days of violent clashes, Joseph Kretzer opened fire on the hostages. As the situation escalated and the standoff continued, Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes gave up on the escape attempt and returned to their cells. However, Bernard Coy, Joseph Kretzer, and Marvin Hubbard refused to surrender. The battle was so intense that the U.S. Marines were called in. After fierce confrontations, the American forces managed to kill the 3 inmates. After the battle ended, Shockley, Thompson, and Carnes were tried for the murder of the prison guards. Shockley and Thompson received the death penalty. As for Carnes, who was only 19 years old at the time, he was sentenced to life in prison. After that, a few more attempts occurred, all of which failed quickly. The failed escape attempts I've told you about all demonstrate the difficulty of escaping from this prison. Every failed attempt reinforced the prison's reputation as inescapable and sent a message to the other inmates that escape was not just impossible, Their very lives would be on the line. But all of that would change in 1962, specifically on the night of June 11th, when Frank Morris, John Anglin, and Clarence Anglin decided on a quiet summer night to execute their daring escape plan, a plan that required great precision and flawless execution, which had taken them months to prepare. Frank Morris was the mastermind who chose the Anglin brothers because they were known for their swimming skills. Each of the three inmates had a life story full of events that shaped his character and enabled him to conceive of escaping from a prison that everyone considered inescapable. Frank Morris was born on September 1st, 1926, and was orphaned when he was just 11 years old. He was forced to spend his life in one of the foster homes in Washington. From there, his path into crime began at a young age. The first crime he committed was when he was only 13 years old, which was the beginning of a series of crimes he would commit throughout his life, from drug possession to armed robbery to car theft. Every time he was arrested, he would plan an escape from whatever prison he was in, which increased his fame in the criminal world to the point that he was known as the smart criminal who could escape from any prison. Morris was known for his superior intelligence. His IQ was 133, placing him in the top 2% of the world's population. Not only was he smart, but he also had an exceptional ability for planning and organization. Escaping from prisons was a game for him. His last escape was just a year before entering Alcatraz when he managed to escape from a Louisiana prison where he was serving a 10-year sentence for bank robbery. He remained a fugitive for a year before being arrested again while trying to commit another robbery. In January 1960, Morris was transferred to Alcatraz in an attempt by the authorities to crush his hopes of escaping from prison. But when he arrived, he considered the challenge this time to be just harder than the last, nothing more. He was certain that even Alcatraz couldn't hold him. From his first day in prison, he began to study every detail: the timing of the guards, the locations of the cameras, the way the doors opened, every single detail, big and small. A year later, he received news that two old acquaintances had been transferred to Alcatraz with him: John Anglin and his brother, Clarence Anglin. John Anglin was born on May 2, 1930, and Clarence was exactly 1 year younger. The two were born in Georgia to a family of 14 siblings. They were a poor family who all worked in agriculture from a young age. John and Clarence, since they were young, would enter swimming races in frozen lakes and win them. But a life of poverty led them down the path of theft and crime. It started with simple crimes like stealing chickens and crops from the fields they roamed until they graduated to robbing banks in the early 1950s. Their robberies were always characterized by boldness and precision, to the point that they would enter a bank in broad daylight. They always made sure not to harm anyone during the robbery. According to them, they never even carried a real weapon. The only time they were seen with a weapon, it was a toy gun. But on January 17, 1958, while they were robbing a bank in Columbia, Alabama, they were arrested and sentenced to 35 years in prison. They spent part of their sentence in a Florida state prison, but when they tried to escape, they were transferred to a federal penitentiary, which they also tried to escape from. So they were transferred again to the Atlanta prison. When they tried to escape from the Atlanta prison as well, the authorities said, "These guys can only be handled by Alcatraz." On October 24, 1960, John arrived at Alcatraz, and shortly after, Clarence arrived on January 16, 1961. When John and Clarence arrived at Alcatraz and met Morris, with whom they had an old acquaintance, it didn't take many days for that acquaintance to turn into a strong friendship, especially after they learned he was famous for his intelligence and ability to escape from prisons. As for Morris, he saw that these two were the perfect choice for his escape team. Morris knew of their swimming skills, especially in cold water. These were the ones who could swim in the cold water of San Francisco Bay if they succeeded in escaping the prison. While they were studying the prison's vulnerabilities, another inmate named Alan West overheard them. Since his cell was adjacent to Morris's, he contacted him and said, "I can show you an escape route, but on the condition that you take me with you." Alan's job in the prison was to clean the area above the cell block ceiling. One day, while working, he discovered a ventilation shaft that led to the roof. When Morris heard this, he felt there was hope for escape, just as he had expected. He began to use his intelligence to create a meticulous plan to get out through that shaft. After studying the building's design, he saw that the small ventilation grill under the sink in each cell led to a network of interconnected utility corridors. From there, they could reach the ventilation shaft Alan had mentioned. But the problem was that the opening was very small, impossible for an adult to pass through, no matter how thin. And from here began the first challenge in the most famous prison escape in history. With his intelligence, Morris managed to exploit one of Alcatraz's strengths to succeed in the escape. The salt water surrounding the prison had made some parts of the concrete walls weaker than others. One of these walls was the area around the ventilation grills in the cells, which the prison did not regularly maintain like other exposed areas. Here, Morris felt that with a few simple tools, he could widen the openings and pass through. The first step in their plan was to steal spoons from the prison kitchen, which they would use for digging. But the problem was how they would hide the openings after they started digging, and when they would dig without anyone noticing or hearing the chipping sounds from outside the cell. After discussions among the four of them, they agreed that the digging time would be from 6:30 to 7:30 in the evening, as this was the time when inmates were allowed to play musical instruments. The four of them took turns monitoring the guards' movements so that no one would notice what they were doing. After they finished, they would cover the hole with cardboard painted the same color as the wall and place some clutter on it so that nothing looked out of the ordinary. After a week of digging, Morris, being the mastermind, began to look for new tools to speed up the digging process. He found an old saw blade that was discarded in a prison storage room and an old vacuum cleaner. He dismantled it, took the motor, and made a primitive drilling tool to help them execute the plan. By this time, many inmates knew what was happening in the cell of Morris and his friends. In fact, some testimonies say that as many as 80 inmates knew what was happening. But in order to get revenge on the authorities and break the legend of the impossible escape from Alcatraz, none of them reported it, nor did anyone ask to join them. They even helped cover for them. Little by little, the plan evolved. They crafted dummy heads from soap, paper, and the dust from their digging. They would place them on their beds as if they were sleeping and continue digging throughout the night. Clarence was responsible for collecting hair for these dummies, as he worked in the prison's barbershop. After months of digging and widening, all that was left was to think about the most important part of the plan: how to survive the bay's water and reach the nearest shore without drowning or being eaten by sharks. One day, Morris found a page from a magazine called Popular Mechanics *. It contained an article explaining how to build a rubber raft using simple tools. From here, he got the idea to build a raft for their escape. The material they would use was the raincoats that the inmates wore in severe cold. These clothes were made with rubber material, so over time they managed to collect more than 50 of them. They stole an old sewing machine from the prison workshop and also stole steam pipes to heat the rubber and seal the seams. In addition, they secretly stole some wood and nails to make the paddle they would use to steer the raft. All that was left was a place where they could work with all these tools. Here, Alan's role came in again. Alan knew of a completely abandoned area in the prison that no guard ever approached. He deliberately took the dust from his daily digging, threw it on the ceiling, and swept it vigorously so that the dust would fall on the heads of the guards patrolling the cells. When they started getting annoyed by the dust, they allowed him to take old blankets to cover the area to stop the dust from falling while he cleaned. This was a crucial step in the escape plan, and the prison guards themselves had helped them with it. The area he chose was the one with the ventilation shaft that was the basis of the escape idea from the beginning. And because every step was precisely calculated, the holes they dug in their cells allowed them to reach the utility corridors and from there to the abandoned space. Day by day, they began to move all the equipment they had gathered from the prison workshop and turn the place into a secret workshop in the heart of the prison. They started going to the workshop through the secret corridors they had made when the guard patrols were quiet. Of course, they never forgot to leave the dummies they had made on their beds, so if anyone passed by, they wouldn't notice they were gone. At this stage, the plan was finally taking its final shape. Each of them knew his role perfectly and the part he would play in the next phase. Every day, they practiced the steps they would take to ensure they could execute them quickly and without errors. Of course, the raft was the most important goal for them, as it was their only hope of escaping, so it had to be perfect. The night before the escape, the 4 inmates reviewed all the details, tested the raft and the life vests, and began to prepare to execute the plan. Around 9 p.m., Morris, John, and Clarence were in their cells, waiting for the last guard patrol to make their routine rounds and ensure all the inmates were in their places. After that, they would begin the first step of their escape. As soon as the awaited moment arrived, they began to remove the cardboard covering the passage openings. But on the appointed night, Alan couldn't open the vent in his cell. The cement he had used to fix the cardboard had completely hardened. After many attempts, Alan realized he wouldn't be able to join his friends. He decided to return to his cell and surrender to his fate. At that time, Morris and the Anglin brothers had managed to reach the secret corridor. They began to climb the pipes that would lead them to the roof. After coming down from the roof, they faced their second obstacle: the prison's high walls topped with barbed wire. They immediately began to use their primitive tools to cut the wires so they could get to the northern shore of the island. After reaching the shore, they began to inflate the raft using a musical instrument that Morris had modified to blow air without making a sound. And so began their journey in the cold waters, full of strong currents, heading for Angel Island and from there to the mainland. As day broke, around 7 a.m., the guards began their rounds of the cells to wake the inmates. But they were surprised that Morris, John, and Clarence didn't get up, even though they called out to them several times. When one of the guards entered their cell, he discovered it was just a dummy. At that moment, chaos erupted throughout the prison. The guards began to search for the 3 inmates everywhere. They immediately notified the authorities, and a team from the FBI arrived to investigate their disappearance. The first person to be interrogated was Alan West, because of the hole they found in his cell, which was similar to the ones in the other 3 cells. Alan was forced to confess and tell them the plan from the beginning. Based on his confession, a massive search of the island and the surrounding waters began in one of the largest manhunts in FBI history. On the morning of the second day, the FBI found a paddle and some traces of the tools the 3 had used in the water, but there was still no trace of the bodies in the water or on the neighboring shores. When the search team reached Angel Island, they found a plastic bag containing the Anglin family's photos and some personal belongings. And so the question arose: did the 3 actually succeed in their escape? Or did they drown in the cold water after leaving Angel Island? In the years following the escape, many theories emerged. Some suggest they succeeded in their plan and are living somewhere in disguise. The strongest support for this theory comes from the postcards and unsigned letters that their families received from time to time. For instance, John and Clarence's mother would receive letters from an unknown person every so often. When she died, it was said that 2 strange-looking women attended her funeral and left immediately after. Many later suspected that these were John and Clarence in disguise. In 1975, 13 years after their disappearance, a photograph surfaced of 2 men living in Brazil whose features resembled John and Clarence. However, no one was able to track these 2 down afterward. The FBI, after searching for them for 17 years, closed the case and stated that the 3 had surely drowned. Yes. But the real surprise came in 2013 when a letter arrived at the FBI from someone claiming to be John Anglin. He said he was living in San Francisco and was the only survivor of the 3 who escaped. He was ill with cancer and wanted to turn himself in exchange for medical treatment. However, the authorities dismissed the letter, saying it was surely just a hoax. To this day, no one knows if they actually escaped and lived out their lives, or if they drowned before completing their plan. But what is certain is that they shattered the legend that Alcatraz was an inescapable prison. And with that, we reach the end of the story. I'm waiting for your opinions, and if you have a story you want us to tell, write it in the comments. The idea that gets the most interaction, I will work on, God willing. Show me your support now with a subscription, a like, a comment, and all that good stuff. Share the video with anyone you think will like it. I'll see you next time with a story even more thrilling than the last. Peace.